I also wanted to let you know that I started a Patreon account for this podcast to try to get some more revenue from it. That's not the reason why I started this podcast, but I'm trying to get some revenue from the podcast because it will help me keep it going. Um, so if you are willing to donate even $1 or $2 or $5, whatever amount is comfortable for you, to Patreon for Living with an Invisible Learning Challenge, that would be appreciated. You can also use Spotify to donate money, and you can also use BetterHelp to donate money with clicking on the link and becoming a customer of BetterHelp. So those are 3 different ways you can support the podcast, and I hope that you will choose which way works for you, and that you will choose which level works for you as well. And I hope that you do it because the podcast helps you also, and that you are willing to support me in continuing to produce it. Thank you.
And today I am very excited to announce that BetterHelp is now sponsoring this podcast. I have had 7 years of therapy, so I know it can help change your life if you not only let it, but work on the personal goals that you set with your therapist. Without a healthy mind, being truly happy and at peace is hard. The good news is therapy works. But what is therapy exactly? It's whatever you want it to be. Maybe you're not feeling motivated right now and would like some tools to help. Or maybe you're feeling insecure in relationships at work, not dealing well with stress. Whatever you need, it's time to stop being ashamed of normal human struggles and start feeling better because you deserve to be happy. And now you don't have to worry about finding an in person therapist near you to help. BetterHelp is customized online therapy that offers video, phone, and even live chat sessions with your therapist. So you don't have to see anyone on camera if you don't want to. It's more affordable than in person therapy, and you can start communicating with your therapist in under 48 hours. Join the millions of people who are seeing what online therapy is really about. It's always a good time to invest in yourself because you are the greatest asset. And special offering to listeners of Living with an Invisible Learning Challenge. You can get 10% off your first month of professional therapy at betterhelp.com/. I'll put in the link in the podcast description for you. That's BetterHelp, HELEP. Thanks again to BetterHelp for sponsoring this podcast.
Hi, I am Jennifer Purcell, and welcome to my podcast, Living with an Invisible Learning Challenge, where we will discuss, discover, and learn more about the challenges and triumphs of those with NLD and other learning challenges. I do have a website for this podcast, and it is called livingwithnld.com. I also have a Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter account for the podcast. They are all under the same name, which is Living with NLD. I also have a YouTube channel for the podcast, which can be found by Googling the title of the podcast, which is Living with an Invisible Learning Challenge. I would like to tell you about a nonprofit that I use for my research for this podcast. It is called the NVLD Project, and I use their blog for my research. They are a nonprofit that is based in New York and is trying to get NVLD back on the DSM, and they provide many resources for people with NVLD on their website. I'll provide you with the website for them in the podcast description.
All proceeds from the ads on this podcast will be donated towards the NVLD project. Please feel free to explore the other topics on the podcast, and hopefully you will learn something new from them. I hope you enjoyed today's episodes.
Happy Friday, and today's podcast episode is the second part to the interview with me and Barbara Arrowsmith Young. Barbara Arrowsmith Young is an author and a program creator of the Arrowsmith Project, and she has multiple learning disabilities, or challenges as I like to call them. And the first part that I did with her for the interview was posted a couple weeks ago. And in that one, I gave a little synopsis of who she is. But for those of you who didn't get to listen to that episode, she is a Canadian author, entrepreneur, and lecturer. She is the founder of the Arrowsmith School in Toronto and the controversial Arrowsmith program, which forms the basis of the school's teaching method. And this interview with her is talking to her about her program, how she created it, why she wanted to create it, what it does, how it was before the pandemic for her doing the program, how it was during the pandemic, and how it is after the pandemic now. And so I really do encourage you to go to the first part that I posted a couple weeks ago if you didn't listen to that one. And I will also provide a link for that first episode in the podcast description for you. I hope you enjoy the second part to this interview.
So I'm definitely glad you created those programs for students to be able to use online and in person so that they can, like you were saying, have a more successful academic experience and be able to apply those skills that they're learning from the programs elsewhere in their life too.
Mm-hmm.
So you might have touched on this a little bit, but I was going to ask you what kind of gave you the idea to use the programs in the classroom, and where or maybe when is a better word for you doing your first program? Like, what country was it?
Yeah, the first program was in Canada, right? Just because it was close to home, it was easier.
Right.
I had my school in Toronto, and then I started working with a couple of schools in the Toronto region, right? To really trial, is this possible? Because, I didn't know, like, how do I train teachers? How do I transmit this information? And so I learned a great deal, and I'm very, very grateful. So it started in Toronto. Then obviously the United States is right across the border, close. So then we went into the United States, and then I'm not sure where we went next, but I think we're in 13 or 14 countries currently. I sort of lose track. I mean, I do have a map that shows me where we are. But it was really the idea was that I didn't want to limit the benefit just to one location. So that was the motivating factor, because we had people flying from different parts of the world to come to Toronto to come to the program, and that's really disruptive to a family. And there are lots of families that can't
Travel.
Could not afford to do that. So that was really the motivating factor to bring this into schools. And before I did it, I went and talked to several people. There were no cognitive programs at that time, because again, this is in the 1970s, late 70s. But I talked to people that had developed academic programs. So say a reading program, a writing program, because I was here in Toronto, and there's the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, which is the world organization at the University of Toronto. So I had access to some people that had developed programs. And I asked them, what worked and what they felt, hadn't worked in what they had done. And what I kept hearing is they felt that they had created good research-based curriculum for reading or for writing. Um, and they would train teachers in the methodology, give them the kits, um, and then they didn't have any real follow-up or support. So what
Mm.
would happen, as we know in the classroom, nothing works exactly the way you think it should work. So the teachers, wanting to adapt this to their students, would start to modify the program. And so in the end, wouldn't get the results that the people who designed it felt they should, because now the program was modified and it really wasn't the program as it was designed. So
Of
when I
course.
listened to this, from more than one source, I thought, okay, I have to develop a really good support system for the teachers, because for us, because this is stimulating the brain, if the procedures aren't followed, because this is very procedural, I knew that we wouldn't get the results that were required by that student, and my commitment is to that student. So I
Hmm.
knew we had to really support and educate and do ongoing professional development with the teachers, and that we had to build a system that tracked all the data, put like algorithms in to let the teacher know this student is working as expected, so this is great. This student, there's maybe some challenges here we need to investigate. So I built in a whole system to ensure that the programs would be delivered as designed, and that the teachers got the support that they needed to, which meant the students got the program that they needed. So that was a really critical learning for me. And the schools where we are around the world, we have staff here in Toronto that are assigned to all of those organizations, and teachers at those schools can email, they can call. We also have ongoing professional development. We have a huge support system that we've built into our system to ensure the outcomes and the results that we know. So the motivation was to make this work accessible, but to ensure that we would get the outcomes that were designed by the program. And as I said, we do ongoing research, we do internal research looking at all of the data that we gather. We do external research with researchers at universities, and can say with assurance that we are driving change in the brain, driving change in cognition, change in learning, and change in social emotional well-being. So to me, that's our responsibility as an organization, to ensure that what we're doing is in the best interest of the individuals that are receiving the program.
Yeah, that definitely. I remember when you were saying earlier that you really like doing data and tracking it. I enjoy doing that as well with my podcast, and I feel like we both have a passion of helping people, in of course in different ways, but being able to help them if they have a learning difficulty or challenge, or if they don't, being able to help them uh, in- with the programs as well. Um, so uh, the next area was going to be asking about you. You were touching on this as well with the success of your programs, and it seems like they have been very successful, and you've seen good results from them.
Yes, and we never just say, well, that's good enough. We're
Mm,
constantly refining, constantly developing. It's just not in my DNA to say, oh, wow, check that off and we're
hmm.
done. So we're constantly looking at data, looking at patterns, looking at trends, thinking, how can we refine? How can we improve? It's just, part of our commitment to all of the people that we work with. So there's always ongoing development work. And this summer in August, we launched a new delivery model. We call it the independent check-in. And again, we ran it in-house for 2 years, like my school in Toronto is really my laboratory school.
Hmm.
I'm not really in the business of operating a school per se. We need a school to trial things, and then our goal is to put them out into schools around the world. So we tracked, this model for 2 years in-house. We looked at all of the data because, again, I need to be assured that we're getting the same results, and we saw that we were. And then we started to train educators that were interested in that model. And this one works really well for adults and professionals because instead of having to come into a virtual classroom, which commits, like, say, 4 hours a week in a fixed schedule, or come into a physical classroom, which means you've got to go somewhere and, again, commit to fixed time. The individual can work however many hours they want a week independently. So if you want to work at 4 a.m., welcome to it. And people work, best at different times of the day.
Yeah.
We recommend that they should be doing this amount of work each week, like between 3 to 4 hours, not anything under a half an hour, because, to stimulate the brain, you need to kind of warm it up and then work it out and then cool it down. Sort of like physical exercise. And then every 2 weeks, the individual checks in for half an hour with one of the facilitators wherever in the world, just to get feedback, to ask any questions, and then they go off and work on their own schedule again. And so we're really excited about that model, and that's another refinement to make it more accessible. So we're always doing development, and then we track all of the results, and we get also feedback from the individuals that are engaged in the program. And what I love too is we often hear from individuals that are out of the program 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, right? And to me, what's exciting is we know, like, if I go to the gym and build muscle and then I stop, my muscles kind of atrophy somewhat.
Right.
But the brain is actually different. What we're seeing is, once that area is stimulated and functioning well, it continues to get its own stimulation by being worked within the neural network just naturally, right? So the person doesn't have to continue to do the exercise. They build up that cognitive function. It now is engaged with other areas in the neural network and gets its own stimulation. So even though we often use the analogy that, the brain is like a muscle, it's actually different in a sense. And that's what I theorize is happening. And practically, when we track these people all these years out of the program, there's no drop off of function, right? They continue the gains that they made by the end of the program. They continue to have those gains, throughout their lifespan, which is really, really exciting. Like, so it's, that effort and energy somebody puts into doing the work pays off for the rest of their life, which is really positive.
Yeah, that does sound really positive. I'm glad that you have programs for children and for adults to be able to target two populations and, like you were saying, help them in different ways with different programs. What else was I going to ask you? I guess what I was curious was with the feedback that you get on refining the programs, if you're willing to kind of share how that helps to improve them and make it easier for your students.
Well, some of it is in delivery models, like, making models that are more accessible, right? So that certainly improves our delivery and allows us to reach individuals that can't come into more fixed schedules. Trying to think in terms of, well, one of the examples in one of the exercises, that it's the one that I developed for myself, and when I developed it, this was kind of, I'm sure there were computers, they existed, but they weren't really readily accessible. So I did it on paper, and now it's a computer-based program. And what we saw, when we developed it into a computer-based program, is actually students made faster progress because they got more feedback, right? And more feedback. Before, it wasn't that they didn't get feedback, but it was like a teacher standing beside them, giving them feedback. Well, now with the computer, it takes that whole performance anxiety out. Like it's not like a human being is watching me and
Mhm.
giving me feedback. And that was really interesting because I hadn't anticipated that. And to see that taking out that aspect of human interaction was really positive. Obviously, the positive feedback and the encouragement of the facilitator is really important, but this was, a lot of students, if they've had learning difficulties, feel, you know, they're nervous about, teacher feedback because
Yeah.
often it hasn't been positive and it generates anxiety. So that was an interesting learning. And then we saw that, a small percentage of students were moving through the program much faster than we anticipated. Like, obviously it's a challenge if they're moving much slower, and then we have to
Mhm.
understand, is there another cognitive area that's interfering? What is interfering? And we have to investigate and explore that. But here it was the opposite. They were moving much, much faster than, and maybe they had more neuroplasticity, but it was something to investigate. And what we found was there was a small group of individuals that had exceptional visual memory. So like that visual memory I talked about was just off the charts. And so instead of doing the exercise as a reasoned activity, which is what we were trying to stimulate in the brain and processing relationships, they were doing it as a visual activity, which meant it wasn't stimulating that part of the brain at all.
Mm.
And that was, wow. I mean, I thought, well, this is amazing. Like, 'cause I love when I learn these things. And so I said, okay, what can I do to ensure for everybody it becomes a reasoned process? So I added some different levels and different tasks in that now you absolutely can't do those as a visual activity. And it even benefited the students that weren't doing it as a visual activity. So I learn a lot from the students and what I learn in, how they've developed compensations, how they've developed, processes to support them that might actually interfere with what we're trying to do in the exercise, that then allows us to modify the exercise to benefit them and obviously benefit other students. So those are a couple of examples. So we're constantly looking at that, and I get excited when I learn a new compensation that I never anticipated, and I've learned some really amazing ones. Like I'm in awe of is human
Mhm.
creativity, right? I mean, we all have mastery motivation built into us. Like it's just human nature. We want to master things, right?
Yeah.
We want to learn. We want to master. And so if there's a roadblock, people can be very creative in finding ways to get around those roadblocks to try to master. And I learned from that because in our work, and we have lots of conversations with students to say, hey, those compensations worked really well for you. Those were survival mechanisms. We're not saying these are wrong or bad. Actually, thank them because they helped you.
Mhm.
And though to get the benefit of this exercise, we need to work with you to dismantle the compensations within the exercise. And so it becomes kind of a fun process to work with the students to help them understand that. And then they share with us, hey, I'm compensating in this way. And then we learn, and then, like it's kind of like a collaborative process in that
Mhm.
way. And I'm a firm believer of, to be successful, we need to, as much as possible, engage the learner that we're working with, because we're kind of co-creating, their future reality of cognitive change. So, really, really positive. And then, one of the things we work really hard on too is extending the reach of the work. So, it started because of my challenges with learning difficulties. Now we work with students in regular classrooms or mainstream classrooms that majority of them don't have learning difficulties, but some may. And then we're now working with individuals with acquired brain injury and traumatic brain injury, like car accidents, sports injuries, and seeing very similar results. When the brain is injured, it sets up a similar pattern to the brain with an individual with a learning difficulty. So with a learning difficulty, what we're seeing in the brain is there areas that are under functioning or underperforming, and then other areas that are stronger work very, very hard to try to compensate for those underperforming areas. But the
Of course.
challenge is they can't fully because they're not designed to do that job. So what happens is you have a brain that's working really, really hard, but not terribly efficiently. And then what we see with the individuals with traumatic brain injury, obviously there's areas underperforming because of the trauma, and
Mhm.
then areas where there isn't trauma do that same pattern of overcompensating and working really hard to try to do um, what those other areas aren't able to do or only able to do in a limited way. And again, you get a brain that's working very hard, that gets exhausted, but not efficiently. And to me, that was fascinating when we saw the imaging work in both groups. And then what we see as they're working through the program, because we've done imaging studies, is for the students with learning difficulties, those kind of underperforming or underconnected areas start to strengthen in connectivity, both within and between networks, and those hyperconnected areas start to relax, right? So then you get a
Mm.
brain that's working much, much more efficiently. So those areas that were hyperconnected to try to do a job they couldn't now can work normally, do the job that they're designed to do, along with those areas that are now strengthened. And we're seeing a similar pattern in individuals with traumatic brain injury. So to me, that's really
Fascinating.
fascinating. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But if you think about a student, my experience and maybe your experience in school was I worked probably 50 times harder than other students, but I didn't get the results, that one would think should line up with that 50% more effort. So again, just like the brain, I found that fascinating. The brain is working so much harder, but not getting the results one would expect with that amount of effort. And that's mirrored in the classroom. The child is working that much harder, but it's not showing up, in their classroom results, or not showing up consistently. I mean, I could sometimes, get 90% on an exam, but sometimes I got 10% on an exam. And my teachers assumed for the 10% I didn't study. Well, I studied equally hard to get that 10%.
Mhm.
If I did the 90%, that 10% was targeting more of my difficulties than the 90%. But yeah, I just find the brain fascinating.
It is fascinating. I remember when I was in college before the first 2 years before I was diagnosed with NLD, um, it it was so hard for me to pass my classes at Berkeley, and then when I had my accommodations for the next 2 years, I I got A's and B's. Even
Mm,
though I was still working really hard, I had more programs that were helping me in a different way.
mhm.
So I can definitely relate to what you were saying, where you were working harder, but it wasn't showing up.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
that's challenging. And then when we think about attentional problems, like ADHD, and I think in some cases it's that cognitive fatigue. Like it's the child is working, or the student is working so much harder that the brain gets exhausted,
Hmm.
at a certain point, I read this article on rolling brownouts. I love that term, like a rolling brownout in the brain, where the brain just can't sustain that amount of energy and firing. So it kind of just shuts down somewhat in regions, and then attention wanders, and then the child gets labeled as having an attentional problem, when really it's a cognitive load, a brain having to work way too hard to do what other students can do without that amount of effort, and you can't sustain that. So it's normal that attention wanders. And what we see as students work through this program that have attentional problems is the majority of them no longer have attentional problems at the end,
Hmm.
because now their brain can work efficiently, it can process information, it can focus, it can attend. It doesn't have to put that kind of what I call heroic effort into the learning process. And so they can sustain and engage in the learning process with focused attention.
That's amazing. I was going to ask you if you, it sounds like you do know what some of your students have when they have learning difficulties, because you mentioned ADHD.
Mhm. Yes.
Um,
So,
Go
yes.
ahead.
So students come in with a range of diagnostic labels, right? And I'm I recognize that they have value, but I think sometimes somewhat limited value. Like I've seen students identified as having a diagnosis of dyslexia. I look at the reports and I don't understand how they came up with this diagnosis. Like to me,
Mm-hmm.
what's more important is looking under the label, and for that individual, what cognitive functions are underperforming, what ones are working well, and what ones are underperforming. And that's what we need to address, because I've seen, 5 students with the same diagnostic label, and each one has a different cognitive profile. And so for me, the diagnostic label isn't useful to lead to treatment. I have to understand the cognitive functions under those diagnostic labels. And as humans, we like diagnostic labels because it helps us categorize people.
Right.
And again, I'm not saying there isn't value, but for us, the next step is to go under the label. And for that particular individual, what are the things that are leading to that label? And those are the functions that we have to address and have to strengthen with that individual. So, and then some students come to us where the parents are really recognizing that the child doesn't have a diagnosis at this point, but they're seeing their struggles in school. And don't want to wait for a diagnosis. They want to address the problem. So we have a whole range. And a lot of the students that come in with a diagnosis, by the end of the program, if they go back and get a psychoeducational assessment update, they're de-identified. They no longer have that diagnostic label because we've addressed the underlying cognitive functions that led to that label. And now those functions are working and they're no longer struggling with learning. Similar to students that come in with attentional difficulties, a number of them come in on medication, and I have nothing against medication. It's, it can be of absolute value. And what we find is about 70 to 75% of those students at the end of the program are off the medication for attention, because now their brain, that cognitive load is no longer there, so their brain can engage in the learning process. And in some cases, if it's the prefrontal cortex, executive functioning, as we strengthen that, part of the job of that part of the brain is to regulate attention. So we've strengthened that part of the brain that actually regulates goal-oriented attention. So, to me, the power of this work is we're going kind of to the base level of what's driving the problem and addressing that rather than addressing the symptoms. And I'm not saying that there aren't, like, your experience in college, you got some useful techniques and tools to use to help you get through college. I did too. I got through my studies, but for me, it took so much more work. Like, I joke, I became a workaholic in grade 1. Like, I came home at lunch, my mother had flashcards. She drilled me with flashcards to learn how to read and to write. I came home after school, I got flashcards, and I didn't like it at the time, but I eventually learned how to read and write and do arithmetic. So I'm grateful. But all of my schooling, it took me, working 20 hours a day just to tread water in school. Like, once I got into university, and sleep 4 hours a night, like 7 days a week. And eventually I developed an autoimmune disorder. And there's research now to show that individuals with learning difficulties are more likely to have, physical illness, physical conditions. Because if we think about the stress hormones, cortisol, it has an impact on the endocrine system, our immune system. And, it's fine. We know occasional stress, there's certain benefit to that, but unremitting long-term stress is not healthy for the body. So, I think I'm not saying anything against compensations and workarounds and strategies. They're all useful. But to me, the power is if we can change the brain and change cognition, then somebody can use those strategies easily and effectively, because we all use strategies no matter what. But they don't have to be relied on, and they don't have to take, all that amount of extra effort and energy that now can be freed up to do other things. And we've seen, even, with some of the students going through the program, they become more creative, which is to me really
Mm,
exciting because it frees up energy in the brain, right? Like if all
mhm.
that energy is going to compensate, like there's not much energy left over for the creative process. And we've seen students that become musicians, opera singers, designers, not everyone, but a certain number that probably had some real strengths in their brain in those areas, but because they were putting so much energy to compensate for the difficulties, that energy wasn't free to use for the creative process. And to me, that's really inspiring and exciting.
Yeah, that is inspiring for them to be able to, apply what they're getting from the programs and improve that area of their life, whether it's with creativity or attention or, like you were saying, wherein they are out of the program and they get reassessed, they don't have that label anymore.
Mhm.
Um, and I love how you know, you're right with the labels. They they only help to some extent
Yeah.
because it is very true that people, even if it's not a label for a learning challenge, but for anxiety or something else, it it can be it can be wrong and it can not be very helpful.
Mhm.
Um, and I think sometimes, I know for me, before I really knew more about who I was and my challenges and my struggles, I think I got lost in the label that they gave me.
Mm.
Um, and then once I knew more about it, it was easier to, um, you know, like you've been able to for yourself and many others, come up with strategies and programs to help yourself and them as well, and you know, um, make it easier for them to apply those elsewhere.
And today I am very excited to announce that BetterHelp is now sponsoring this podcast. I have had 7 years of therapy, so I know it can help change your life if you not only let it, but work on the personal goals that you set with your therapist. Without a healthy mind, being truly happy and at peace is hard. The good news is therapy works. But what is therapy exactly? It's whatever you want it to be. Maybe you're not feeling motivated right now and would like some tools to help. Or maybe you're feeling insecure in relationships at work, not dealing well with stress. Whatever you need, it's time to stop being ashamed of normal human struggles and start feeling better because you deserve to be happy. And now you don't have to worry about finding an in person therapist near you to help. BetterHelp is customized online therapy that offers video, phone, and even live chat sessions with your therapist. So you don't have to see anyone on camera if you don't want to. It's more affordable than in person therapy, and you can start communicating with your therapist in under 48 hours. Join the millions of people who are seeing what online therapy is really about. It's always a good time to invest in yourself because you are the greatest asset. And special offering to listeners of Living with an Invisible Learning Challenge. You can get 10% off your first month of professional therapy at betterhelp.com/. I'll put in the link in the podcast description for you. That's BetterHelp, HELEP. Thanks again to BetterHelp for sponsoring this podcast. As I wrap up, there are some things I would like to share with you. I do have a website for this podcast. It is called livingwithnld.com. I also have a Facebook and Instagram page for this podcast. It is called Living with NLD. I will include the links for those in the description. In conclusion, I would like to hear from my audience. If you know individuals with NLD that I could interview for this podcast, please email me at livingwithnld@gmail.com. What are you interested in learning about NLD? I know I'm not an expert, but I do know I have the living experience of having it. I would like you to practice journaling about your gifts and differences. Also, see if there is a way that you can make that difference become easier for you to do than it originally was. Thank you for listening today, and please go to my YouTube channel and subscribe to it. Thank you. Bye.